In our next example, we're going to look at creating functions that accept parameters where you can, pass an argument to that function. And that's a way of passing values or passing variables from one function or method to another. And the key difference is in our previous examples, we were just doing simple functions. They didn't take arguments, right? They didn't have a parameter list. In this example, inside the open or after the function name, inside open and closing parentheses, we're going to include special variable names. And these variables are known as parameters. Okay? So the key difference between this function and the previous functions we've been working with, the simple functions, is this type of function now takes arguments, right? It has parameters declared in the function definition inside parentheses. So that's a key difference. And also, when you call a method, when you call a function, you pass in those arguments. So look, we have three variables here: min, max, and number of guesses. Okay. Notice that when I call or invoke the function, I no longer now just type the function name, but I also pass in arguments, right? And these are the parameters, min, max, and num guesses, that I declared up here. So it's a way of passing these values in dynamically. And that way I don't have the same values that are in the function every time I call it. I could call this function 10 different times and I could pass in 10 different ranges, 5 and 20, or 2 and 8, or whatever I wanted to do as far as changing the range. And instead of 3 guesses, I could give them 2 guesses, or 1 guess, or 10 guesses. I could change that. Also, at least in ICE, the development environment, it will help you. So if I called a function in ICE, the function name, right, if I hit the dash, let me get the underscore there. Make a letter out of me. No. So, all right, so I've typed the function name. Now watch, if I hit the dash, I get autocomplete, all right? And this is part of Inteli-sense on autocomplete, but those are the parameters. Those are the variables that I can pass into that function. So I know that I can pass in a min, and if I hit enter, it types it out for me. And so the first argument that I would type in, let's say that I want it to start at 5, right? I'm going to hit dash, and because I've already passed in that parameter, notice it's taken out of the list. The only other 2 on the list that remain now appear, and I can choose that. And if I hit enter, then it adds the max parameter. Let's say I want to make it 100. And then finally, if I hit the dash, there's only one parameter left that I haven't used with that method, and that's the number of guesses. And let's say I was going to give them 10 guesses. So that's how I would call or invoke a function that accepts arguments. Arguments are the values, the variables that we pass in, and parameters are those special variables that go inside parentheses when you define a function, okay, that takes arguments, a function that utilizes parameters. But if we were to call this, other than that, it works pretty much the same. So look, I invoke it, I call it, I pass in values 1, 10, and 3 respectively for min, max, and num guesses, okay? And the way it works is it's in sequence. So whatever I pass in here is passed in, it's received in the same order here and assigned to those parameter names. Go through the number, generate a number between minimum and maximum. In this case, what is it? 1 and 10 is what we passed in. When we have that random number, we're going to loop. How many times are we going to loop? Num guesses. What do we pass in? 3, right? So basic for loop. And then inside our for, let me highlight that brace there. So from this brace to this brace, this is all going to iterate 3 times. Okay? Z0, while z is less than num guesses, what got passed in as a parameter, will postfix increment z. We are going to get some input from the player. We have that off by 1 issue, right? Z starts at 0. That's how PowerShell thinks. That's how the computer thinks. But the player thinks, he or she starts counting at 1 and at 0. So we're going to say attempt 1, 2, 3 instead of attempt 0, 1, 2. Now we need to cast it to an integer, right? We've got to convert the data type, because remember that read host always returns a string value, and we can't do math on a string. We can't do a numerical comparison on a string. Okay? We could compare one string to another using equals, because that operator is overloaded to do so with strings, but we can't do that with less than or greater than. So we do have to convert or cast the string data type returned by read host to an integer. Once we do that, is it less than the minimum? Let's check and make sure that they didn't give us some craziness. Did they type in -5 or 0? Well, they can't do that, right? And we'll let them know as much. Let's make sure they didn't type in a value too high. Our max was 10. What if they type in 5 million or 5,000 or even 50? Tell them, hey, that's not right. You can't do that. Invalid. Greater than the maximum or less than the minimum. So there's our if and our else if. And finally, we've tested the 2 values. If it's below the minimum or above the maximum, and if not, then finally this block of code gets executed. What happens here? Guess is valid within range. We display at the console. If they get lucky and they guess our number, what happens? You did it. You guessed my number. And why are we setting z to be 3 here? Because what's the condition? If they guess the number, we're giving them 3 guesses. But if they guess the number, say they get lucky and guess it on the first try, or even the second try, they don't need another guess, do they? So in that case, we need to provide an exit condition for them to break out of this for loop. If they've already guessed it, we don't want to turn around and give them another guess after they've already guessed it and won. So that's all we're doing here. We're saying, well, z is less than number of guesses, so that's 3. So if z becomes 3, we're going to break out of this for loop. Now, that's one way to do that. Another way, we use the keyword break. There's all kinds of ways that you could provide an exit condition for that for loop. This is just one. And then, okay, so if they didn't guess it, can we give them a clue? If their guess is greater than the number, hey, my number is smaller. And if their guess is not greater than the number, that means it must be less than the number. If it's not equal to the number, and it's not greater than the number, the only possibility left, it must have been smaller, and therefore the computer's number is bigger. And we've already checked whether or not it's a valid range up here. So if we were to run this, 1 in 10, guess my number, I'm going to hit the middle, start out at 5. Number was bigger, let's go to 7. Number was bigger, let's go to 9. Number was bigger, number was 10. Boy, I was super unlucky. Alright? But that does, let's see if I get lucky and I guess it one time. Start at 5 again, smaller, go to 3. Number was smaller, I'll go to 2. Oh, man. Really unlucky today with the random stuff. Okay, 5. Number was bigger, 7. Number was bigger, 9. I did it. Finally. You did it. You guessed my number, 9. What I'm trying to do is reach the condition where, tell you what, we'll make it easier. Let's modify our argumentation. Instead of between 1 and 10, let's generate a random number between 1 and 5. So when we invoke or call the function here, now our maximum will be 5. So that gets taken as an argument here, right? It comes in as 5. The random number that then gets generated, instead of between 1 and 10, now it's between 1 and 5. We always add a little 1 there. Alright, so here we go. And I'm going to run it. 3 guesses, 1 through 5, my odds are pretty good, right? If I lose this, then I really suck. So it's bigger. All right, 3. So I'm gonna go 4. I did it. I guessed my number. And see, this then occurred. Z was set to 3, which then provided the exit condition to exit this for loop right here. Then Z was no longer less than number of guesses 3. So there's my exit condition for my for loop. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So that's an example with our number guessing game. Let's take a look at another example where we are passing in arguments. Let's see. That was our number game. Let's look at a Pokemon example. Okay. Going to clear the console there. So in this case, we're going to rewrite our create Pokemon function, our method. Earlier it was just a simple function. It had no parameters, took no arguments. Now, create Pokemon will take 3 arguments, okay, that get passed to it. Essentially, the code does the same thing. It's gonna, take on the responsibility of setting the species, the name, the gender, and generating the random stats. That's all going on here with getRandom. But the way that we call it, the way that we invoke it will now be different. Display Pokemon does the same thing, that it did in version 1 of our Pokemon game. But look at the difference in how we call it. Now when we can't just call create Pokemon. Now when we call create Pokemon, because we've coded it to accept 3 parameters, we have to pass in 3 arguments: the species, the name, and the gender. Okay? Alright. So let's run it and see what happens. And then it's going to call display Pokemon. Same thing, right? There's my name, my species, my gender. It's all set there, right? If I wanted to, I could do a Pikachu, and we could call him Bob. We could make a male. So I could change the value of the arguments when I call this method, and it would get passed to the function as these parameters. And now let's see what happens. So now I have a Bob who is a Pikachu, and he's male. Okay? Your choice. Sometimes the way you're coding your scripts and your apps, you might just want a simple function. It doesn't take any parameters. You don't have to pass in any arguments. Other times, you may want to code functions that accept arguments, that have a list of parameters that they take and the parentheses. So we looked at one way of coding a function with parameters to accept arguments, and that's adding them in parentheses right after the function name. But in PowerShell, there's another way. There's the Param Structure. This is even more versatile. So same thing. Inside this Param Structure, I declare min, max, and num guesses. Those are my parameters. And in the same way, I can call them. So if I have the function name, oh my gosh, it's so hard to type on this broken keyboard. My shift keys are broken, my tilde is gone, my 5 is gone. Okay, anyway. All right, so again, notice autocomplete, right? Inteli-sense picks up on those arguments in the param list. And I could modify or change the way that I call it. So if we were to run this, I just want to show you that in this example, it does the exact same thing that our previous example with the number game did. All right, so if I run it, I'm passing in as arguments 1 for minimum, 10 for maximum, and 3 for the number of guesses. Comes into my Param structure. When I make the random number, it's between 1 and 10. Okay, the number of guesses in my for loop is 3. So to show you that the behavior is no different in our code, I get 3 guesses. I start at 5. Number was bigger, I'll go to 7. Number was smaller, well, it has to be 6 then. There we go. Okay? So no difference there. Oh, this keyboard is driving me insane. All right, now let's look at another example. And we're going to look at default parameters, in this case for guess the number. So now we have another param structure here. In this case though, we are setting the data type. We're telling PowerShell we expect integer data types to be passed in as arguments. So we don't want strings to be passed into this function or some other data type that we haven't coded it to deal with, right? Now, if the user of our function passes an argument, then whatever that argument is passed in, that value will be assigned to min, max, and guesses. But if for some reason they don't, let's say that they just call the function name and don't pass in the required parameters, these are called default parameters. So in the absence of a value, this value will be substituted. That's the idea behind default parameters. You understand? So let's take a look at that, right? We have a method here, and we'll do between 1 and 5. So just to show you that this works like the previous example, I'm going to run it. Oh, this keyboard's driving me nuts. Okay, guess number between 1 and 5. Let's start at 3. Did it? Guess the number. Yay! Got it the first time. All right. Okay, so that's fine. Now, what if we just called the function? I'm not passing in those arguments now. Will the default values be used? Let's try it. Let's run it. See? I didn't pass in the values, even though it's coded to accept parameters, but it used these default values instead. So we're good, even though I didn't pass in the required arguments. Okay, number is 10. Now, what if I did not declare default arguments, right? See how I'm calling this and I'm not passing in the arguments it's expecting that I should? If I did not declare arguments, how would that change things? So let's do min, max, and num guesses. Oh man, this keyboard is horrible. Need a USB keyboard. Okay, so let's see what happens if we take away the default arguments and I try to call this function a method. How are these variables going to have any values? And what repercussions is that going to have for my function? I'm expecting values for these 3 variables, but now I don't have any. So let's see what happens. Logic issue, right? Values are null. My number is 0. I can't make a random number if min has no value and max has no value. How can I generate a random number? And how can I loop for number of guesses if num guesses has no value? So if I don't declare default arguments, then I absolutely have to pass in a value here. So minimum, this would be fine if I passed in the required arguments. Maximum, we'll say 5, and number of guesses, we'll say 3. Okay, so if I did that, and my param structure is coded this way, yeah, that's fine, watch. They're not null. So we're good to go, right? That's the number. But what if I try to call that method without passing in the required argumentation? Oh, look what happens. Big logic issue, right? Because those are null. They don't have any values. But if we declare default parameters, our function can fail or execute just fine. or fail more gracefully, or whatever. Just to give you an idea of why it may be a good idea to add default parameters in a param structure. But look, let's run it. Even though I'm not passing in any argumentation, I'm gonna run it, and it runs just fine. 1 through 10 guesses, and 5 bigger, 7 bigger, 9. Got it. Number was 9. Okay. Does that make sense? Hope so. Hope that makes sense. Okay, let's look at yet even another example here. Let's see. Let's look at parameters with our Pokemon game. Okay, same thing going on here, right? Species, name, and gender. So now when we call create Pokemon, we've got to pass in these arguments. And if we wanted to, we could code this to have, default arguments. That were the case. We could say that species will default to Pikachu or Charmander, and name will default to Bubba, and gender will default to male, or something like that if we wanted to. Okay, and if we were going to do that, how would we do that? Let's give ourselves a little bit of space here. Okay, so basically just set it up here, right? And I'm going to add this on a second line so it's a bit more clear. Species, let's say that our default would be Pikachu. And let's say that our default name would be Bubba. And let's say our default gender will be male. Okay? So we could add default arguments if we want to. Now when we create a Pokemon, it's going to be a Mimikyu and a Carly and a female because arguments are supplied. But if we do not supply the arguments, then in this example, if we just call the function name, now that we've coded our param structure to use default arguments, watch what happens. Now it's a Bubba and it's a Pikachu. Capiche? Yeah. Okay. You can also code default parameters the more traditional, C++ or Java way. But I recommend using a param structure in PowerShell. But if we wanted to, we could code it this way. And so we could pass in the arguments, right? Grand Gala and name. Nightmare Moon. Wow. And we'll pass another argument. Age. Let's say 1,000. I don't know. Whatever. Okay. So if we pass that in, let's see what happens. Welcome to the Grand Gala. Name Nightmare Moon. Age 1,000. Okay. So it works as expected if we pass in arguments, and if we did not pass in the required or expected argumentation, let's see what happens. It defaults to Celestia and age 100. Here's an example of a simple ping sweeper function, okay? And in this case, we've coded it to accept 2 parameters, so we'll feed it 2 arguments down here. It'll be the network address portion, depending on what we're subnetting, 2 octets or 1 or 3. The number of hosts per subnet. Now there's only 254 valid, because remember 0 is the network address and 255 is broadcast. But just to show you looping through the sequence, and in this example, we really want to start with 1, right? And instead of x, we kind of want to start with 1 where x is 0, so we could initialize it to be 1 if we wanted, since we don't really want to ping the network address. But so if we run it, x starts out as 1, and look what happens. So host address 1054.2.1, and it's just pinging. It's just looping through in this for loop using the ping command. Okay, and it would continue And we could control the number of echo replies if we wanted by passing in more arguments. But just sort of trying to illustrate a very simple ping sweeper using a for loop and a function that, in this case, accepts 2 arguments, or 2 parameters up here. Now we're going to look at functions that return a value, okay? And when a function returns a value, I have an example here. Let's take a look at this method or this function. And so we have a variable A has a value 100, a variable B has a value 7. C is going to be a variable that holds the result of multiplying A times B, okay? Well, here's a special keyword in PowerShell. When PowerShell hits the keyword return, it exits or leaves the function. And whatever's to the right of return, it returns the value, the current value of that object. So what that does is that changes the way we invoke or call the function. You have to call it a bit differently. And you can almost think of this like throwing a baseball. So when calculate1, the function calculate1 gets to the return statement, the keyword return, it's going to return the value C, the result here of A times B. This is the baseball. It throws a baseball. Well, when we throw a baseball, we have to catch it with something. If we don't, we might break a window, right? And I want you to kind of remember that in programming in PowerShell. When you are dealing with functions that return values, you always want to do something with that return value. Even if it's just assign it to null and do nothing with it at all, you should still say, you should still assign the return value to null. If you don't, you can have unexpected logic errors in your code. You have baseballs flying all over the place and breaking windows if you don't have someone to catch those flying baseballs. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but I'm running with it. I'm going to go with it. So when you see the keyword return, that function throws a baseball, you need to catch that baseball. Don't let it fly off and damage a window or something. So how does that change how you invoke the function? Well, look, I have to have a variable result, and I have to catch the return value. So remember that the assignment operator says take whatever happens on the right and assign it to or store it in the variable on the left. So I run the function calculate1, it returns a value. I store that value, that result that I get from return in the variable result, and then I can display result. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so a normal function you'd call like this, right? If it did not have a return statement. But in this case, we do have a return statement. So we can't just call the function like we've done with simple functions, and even like we've done with functions that take parameters and default parameters, yet don't return values. Now that we have a function that returns a value, we have to catch the value in a variable. And if we run it, let's see what happens. Example 1, 700, right? The results of 100 times 7. Okay. Let's look at a few more examples here of functions that return values. All right, so that was integers. What about a string? Let me grab this here. Okay. And let me grab the code to call this. Okay, so now we have another function that returns a value, but the data type is different. It's not integer. In this case, it's a string value. But if I return a string value, I still have to catch it, don't I? So let's see what happens. Drag this out some so we have a little bit of console room, and we'll run the function. Example 2, hello Celestia, I'm having a really nice time, right? Twilight Sparkle's writing her letter back home to Princess Celestia. Okay, so again, I'm just catching the return value in this example. Okay, let's look at this example. We'll throw it over here. Here we want to retrieve a pony's age. So we're inside get pony age 1 function. All right, age is 14. How old is my pony? What am I returning? Age. Now I want you to see something here, okay? So how would I call this method? This returns a value. I need to catch that baseball, right? So wouldn't I want to assign it to a string variable? So we'll just call it message. How about that? And we're going to call get pony age 1. Okay. Now, if I did that, I'm not displaying this. So let's see what happens. Nothing. I mean, it is returning a value, and I am storing that value here inside the variable message, but I haven't called anything that would output the contents thereof to the console. So why don't we pass that into write host? And if I do that, I'm going to pass this variable as an argument into write host, and now let's see what happens. Okay, see, now inside get pony age 1 function, how old is my pony? 14. But why? What's going on here? If you are a C++ or Java or C# programmer, you're probably like, what the heck? Well, in C++ or Java, this is all I would be returning. If I wrote this function in those languages, in a lot of languages, all I would get would be the value 14, okay? This is one of the ways PowerShell is a bit different. Here, because I'm using the write method, this string and this value and this string all get returned with the return value of age. Sometimes that's just not what we want, right? We just want a particular value, okay? Again, if we run this function returning a value with the write method, notice that here we're just outputting something to the console, and here this is the only value we want to return. That's not what we want, is it? And let's do this. We're going to add this in. So we're going to say pony age message. Well, we want this age 14. That's all we want to return, right? But look what happens. If I run that, it's all mixed together and mashed together with the string data that was being output inside this function. It's not what we want. So if I change the value to write host, and now if I run it, look what happens. Okay? Now that's what we want. So this displays to the console, and this displays to the console. But here, pony age message, the only thing that's getting returned in this instance is the value 14 or age, hence pony age 14, and not all the string data up here that happened inside the function. To make this more clear, how about I do this? Alright, so and we'll just add so we're inside the function, okay? And then here we'll say outside the function, okay? So if I call that again, inside the function, see, inside get pony age 1 function, how's my pony? Now outside the function, I get the value pony age. Is that a bit more clear? Hopefully. So depending on whether you use write or write host in a function that returns a value, you can get varying results. Your mileage may vary, but get pony age 2, again, we wouldn't have that problem in this case. Let's look at this. example as well. Write information is another possibility. Drag this over so you can see. But with write information, you'll need to add an information action argument of continue. And again, so let's look at when we're inside. And how old is my pony? And let's look at the return value. So if we run this, inside function, inside pony age 1 function, how old is my pony? Outside function, pony age is 14. Okay, so write host and write information. If you want to display data or information inside of a function that returns a value, be wary of using other methods like write. You may not be getting what you expect. You might be getting string data information when you're only expecting integer data, something like that. Okay. Now, what about a function that returns a value and also accepts argumentation? We could combine both of those if we wanted to. So I'm going to add a variable here, and we'll just say age, okay? And now that would change the way that I call this, right? So now when I call it, notice that autocomplete brings up the age parameter. I can pass on an argument. Say my pony is 10 years old, all right? So in this example, we've coded a function that it accepts a parameter and it also returns a value. So you can do all this. If I run it, it works as expected, right? My pony age is still 10. Okay. In this case, I'm passing in an argument. Or what if we wanted to do this? What if I wanted to set up a param structure for parameter? And okay, could we do that? Let me get rid of my parentheses there in the end. Sure, we could do that too. So we have both a return statement and we're accepting parameters. We'll add another, I'll tell you what, we'll do another variable too. So we'll do pony age and pony name. How old is my pony? Let's say, and okay, we'll display the pony name. I'm taking 2 parameters, but I can only return 1 value. Okay, so notice that. But in this case, if I were going to call it, now I have to pass in a name as well. All right. So if I did that and I ran it, what would be the case in this case? Oh, that should have been a terminating statement. Get rid of that there. Okay, so how old is my pony? My pony name is Carly. Outside function, pony age is 10. Does that make sense? Okay. And we could add default arguments as well, if we wanted to. Let's say that my default pony age will be 5. Okay, and my default pony name will be Bubba. Okay, and if I did that and I called it without passing in the required parameters, now I have a param structure with default arguments. We'll run it. Okay, and my pony name is Bubba, and outside the function my pony name is age. Okay, so we've looked at all different kinds of ways of setting up and using functions. Simple functions that have no parameters, arguments, or return values. Functions that have parameters and take arguments, and functions with param structures that take arguments and have parameters, and functions that return values, and functions that return values and take parameters. Okay, we can combine them. Last, but certainly not least, let's take a look at command line arguments. These are arguments you can pass in as parameters to functions when you launch a script directly from the command prompt, instead of launching it from ICE or an IDE. So in this first example, to show you that there's sort of a default parameter or argument with any script that you call from the console, and it's an array. And we haven't gone over arrays yet, so I don't expect you to understand that unless you have experience with arrays in other languages, in which case, of course, you understand it. But if not, this is the first time you've heard the expression array, and you're like, what the heck's an array, Carly? Don't worry about it. We're going to cover that soon, okay, in some of the subsequent videos after functions. For now, though, just know that it's a collection of arguments separated by a delimiter, in this case of a space, or you could set up a comma or something. But and so you can pass in multiple arguments. You can take multiple parameters from a command line function, but there's a built-in collection of all those arguments that get passed in, and that's all we're doing here. We're going to run this from the shell, from the command prompt. And it's just going to say right inside script 1 a total of, this is a special method, args.count. This is going to tell us when we call this function, however many arguments we pass in, it's going to look at the spaces between them, and it's going to count them each as a separate string, and it'll tell us how many arguments that we have passed in. And then we just have a basic for loop here, and in the for loop we're going to say argument, and then each argument, the index subscript value, remember it starts at 0, not at 1. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many arguments that we pass in. So if I was going to code a function that accepts command line arguments, I'd have to write the script like this and save it as a file in a directory. And then when I run it, the way that I run it is special. I need to go to that directory, and I need to do dot, and in this case the backslash, not the forward slash, the name of the script, and then I have to pass in, these are all my arguments right here. Okay, does that make sense? So if I go here, I want to go to D, and I want to change directory to okay, and in this directory, and I want to go to module 5, and I could type in the absolute path if I wanted, but it's just easier, or maybe not. I don't know. CD module 5. But if I actually go to the directory, I won't have to type in the absolute path. I could just make it relative. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm in the right directory, and then I can access that script. So right here's script 1, right? Here's my script 1 file right here, and I'm in that directory. The way I want to run a command line script, the dot and the backslash, not the forward slash. And notice that the cool thing about ICE, look, it gives me all these scripts I can run. But the ones that I specifically have coded is, in this case, is script 1, okay? And then my argument list, in this case, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And I'm just going to copy and paste because I don't want to type all that out. I'm lazy. And I'll split that into one more argument there, okay? So, again, I'm in the directory, right? Dot, backslash, the name of my script, and then the arguments, the parameters that I'm going to pass in. And this is inside my script. It's just going to tell me the number, right? This is that built-in default collection of arguments. And I'm going to cycle through, and we'll be able to see that a script that takes command line arguments actually takes them or reads them in as an array, right? So that collection gets fed into an array and it's indexed with a subscript value, and we can go through array elements, which we'll see when this for loop executes right here when we call it. Okay, so we hit enter, and when I hit enter, look what happens. A total of 8 arguments were passed to this function. But remember that fence post or that off by 1 thing we were talking about? It'll become more clear when we go over arrays. So remember, PowerShell, the computer, he doesn't start at 1, he starts at 0. So yeah, there's still 8 elements, but they're indexed, or they're counted 0 through 7, not 1 through 8. But these are all of our arguments here, right? Separated by spaces. If I were to call it again, and combine docious, now there's only 7 arguments, but they're indexed 0 through 6. So that's that built-in array. And then I could take any one of these, the subscript value, and based on that parameter, that argument, I could branch off and do something different with my code. So that's how I take arguments from the command line, right, from a command prompt. Let's take a look at another command line argument example. Okay, and we're in our same directory here. But in this code, we're going to use our familiar Pokemon game example. And we have a param structure. So we want to take in 3 arguments. All right, we have 3 parameters in this function, species, name, and gender. Here we just put Pokemon stats in line to sort of simplify the method. So what happens when we call this from the console, from a command prompt? PowerShell is going to execute these statements. It'll say inside script 2. Remember that every argument separated by a space that we pass in is basically an array with a subscript value. I know we haven't gone over arrays yet, but we have to break this elephant up into bite-sized pieces, so we'll do that later. So if this is confusing or fuzzy, just kind of put it on the shelf, because we're going to come back to it and cover arrays in detail. For now, remember, array is just a collection of objects, so in this case a collection of strings that we pass in as an argument. And it's indexed with values that start at 0 and count from 0 to the last element stored in the array. So this would be the first argument, and the second argument, and the third argument. Now I have to remember, parentheses change precedence. So if we have a parenthetical expression, it changes precedence. In this case, I have to wrap this in an outer set of parentheses, and I put a $sign in front of it because I want to take that argument, that whole argument, which is an object as an element in the array, and I want to translate it or convert it into the original string that the end user or the player types in this case. Okay, so that's all I'm doing here with this set of parentheses, because this is the actual array object itself, but that's not what we want. We want to convert that. We want to get at the value, the string value stored there in that element. And we do that for all 3. We assign it to a local species, name, and gender, and then when we call create Pokemon, we're going to pass in as arguments species, name, and gender, which would get fed into these 3 parameters here, right? Remember to run it, we need to do dot and backslash. So I'm just going to list my directory contents, make sure that my file's there. In this case, here's script 2. It's there. That's what I want. So I'm going to run script 2, and notice autocomplete pops up when I do this. I can choose script 2, scope right into it, and my 3 arguments. Okay, now the arguments, I have to follow this. I need to follow the structure syntactically. So I'm expecting species, name, and gender. So let's make sure that we do that. So Mimikyu will be my species. Now my name, I'm going to do first and middle name. Just to show you an example of an argument with spaces. So if it was just a single string, I wouldn't need the double quotes, but because I'm passing in basically a compound string or a string with a space in the middle, I need to enclose that in double quotes to make that my second argument. And then my third argument, so what do we got? We got species, we've got name, and then gender. And I'm going to choose unicorn. My gender is unicorn. All right, so if I run it from the command prompt, let's see what happens. Inside script 2, create a new Pokemon, species Mimikyu, name Carly Solelli, gender unicorn, and then here are my stats: Carly Solelli, Mimikyu, unicorn, 106 and 7. So those are 2 examples of writing functions that you can run from the command line and that accept command line arguments.